This is News on China. China's GDP grows 8.1% to $18 trillion in 2021, the largest jump in a decade. Foreign trade rises nearly 30% and hits record high, totaling over $6 trillion. The U.S. contributes over half of China's record trade surplus of $676 billion. Foreign direct investment also reaches a high of $180 billion, growing 14.9%. Plastics waste from e-commerce and food delivery have skyrocketed in the past decade. In 2020, 1.1 million tons of white pollution was generated from 83.4 billion packages. The recycling rate stagnated in recent years as China's plastic production increased. The low environmental tax and last year's plastic ban have had limited effects on reduction. President Xi maintains a zero-tolerance stance on corruption as part of the CPC's self-reform. Since 2012, 900,000 members were expelled and 400 high-level officials were removed. Top anti-corruption bodies sanctioned 414,000 officials in the first 3 quarters of 2021. With wide public support, efforts are central in the lead-up to CPC's 20th National Congress. China's once thriving newsstands are dwindling as print media declines. Emerging a century ago to sell newspapers and basic goods, newsstands grew rapidly in the 1990s. The stalls employed laid-off workers after the restructuring of state-owned enterprises. Shanghai's 3,000 newsstands declined to 200 by 2019, further decreasing during the pandemic. Beijing hosts the Winter Olympic Games with strict anti-Omicron measures and reduced attendance. More than 2,000 athletes and 25,000 workers will stay in a bubble and take daily tests. The Games will be carbon neutral, powered by renewable energy sources only. China is trying to build public interest in winter sports, which remain unpopular. Record trade between China and Russia grows 35.8% in 2021 to $146 billion. Energy megaprojects, such as the Power of Siberia 1 pipeline, boost trade. The US and the EU stir up tensions in Ukraine and threaten new sanctions against Russia. Sino-Russian relations strengthen, and a surprise is expected during Putin's Olympics visit. The central government releases a report on the devastating floods in Henan province last year. The local government was blamed for the high death toll of 398 people and $18.9 billion in losses. Officials ignored weather warnings, underreported deaths, and misused flood prevention funds. 87 civil servants have been demoted or dismissed after key findings were released. Women's rights and interest protection law receives overwhelming public feedback. 80,000 people suggested 390,000 changes to the National People's Congress draft law. Government's proposal addresses sexual harassment, workplace inequality, and property rights. Gender issues have been widely debated on social media and by a polarized Chinese public. In his first overseas trip of 2022, Foreign Minister Wang Yi visits Eritrea, Kenya, and Comoros. Wang called for peace in the Horn of Africa and pledged to appoint a special envoy to the region. This region with significant Chinese investments has seen civil wars, insurgencies, and military coups. China seeks a bigger role to broker peace as it deepens South-South relations. Cooperation between China and Latin America and the Caribbean deepens, worrying the White House. Last month, China and Cuba signed a cooperation plan within the Belt and Road Initiative. A 2024 comprehensive action plan was signed between the 34 countries at the China-CELAC Forum. Investments shift from commodities to manufacturing, services, and communication technology. Half of school-aged children of migrant workers live apart from parents, says a new report. China has nearly 20 million children aged 6 to 14 who have migrated with their parents to cities. Around 26.7 million children have been left behind to the care of other family members. A new law regulating parental behavior includes measures to help left-behind children. The government announces the construction of 6.5 million low-cost rental housing units by 2025. The plan covers 40 cities and represents about 26% of total new housing supply in the period. The measure aims to benefit 13 million new residents as part of the Common Prosperity Goal. Increasing the supply of affordable housing is a high priority in the country and for President Xi. Nicaragua restores diplomatic relations with China after severing ties with Taiwan. Since 2016, under Tsai Ing-wen, 8 countries have cut ties with Taiwan. Beijing and Managua begin cooperation to combat COVID-19 and discuss projects in other areas. China donated over 1 million COVID-19 vaccines to the Central American country. In December 2001, after 15 years and 37 meetings, China became a member of the WTO. In 20 years, the country went from being the 6th to the 2nd largest economy of the world. Its trade volume grew from $516 billion to $5 trillion during that time. China has signed over 400 multilateral agreements and 128 bilateral investment treaties. Beijing creates an online platform to provide free tutoring to students. By 2022, the tool will be available to 330,000 elementary school students in the city. The content is available from 6 to 9 p.m. on weekdays, except on holidays. The decision aims to meet parental demand after the reform of the private tutoring sector. China observes the National Memorial Day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre. In 2014, the country began commemorating December 13th to remember the 1937 invasion. In 6 weeks, Japanese troops killed more than 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers. With 61 still living survivors, the date is fundamental to maintaining peace. The 1,035-kilometer China-Laos Railroad begins operations, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The railroad should increase trade between the two countries from 1.2 to 3.7 million tons up until 2030. The project aims to transform Laos into a logistics center in Southeast Asia. China has created industrial and logistics parks along the railroad to improve the local economy. Chinese government and think tanks publish studies and organize events on democracy. Actions take place days before the Summit on Democracy organized by President Biden. Chinese public debate domestic and international contradictions of American democracy. This includes military invasions, support for coups d'etats, and the power of capital in politics. Tsinghua University study calculates economic gains if China reaches its carbon neutrality goals. This includes 81% reduction of accumulated climate change-related losses by 2100. Losses, currently totaling $50 billion a year, would decrease by $134 trillion in this period. Climate warming in China at 0.27 degrees per decade is significantly higher than the global average. Cheap and popular, bike rental services struggle to survive in Chinese cities. With billions of dollars in investment, China had 23 million rental bikes by 2018. Despite practicality, business profits are limited, and government began regulating use in 2017. New companies are introducing electric bike rentals and improving services on apps. The 8th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, is held in Dakar, Senegal. In the opening speech, President Xi Jinping promises 1 billion doses of vaccines for Africa. 600 million doses will be donated and 400 million produced in partnership with African countries. China will send 500 specialists for 10 poverty alleviation and agricultural projects. Macau, the world's largest gambling hub, faces tougher restrictions for casino operators. The ex-Portuguese colony overtook Las Vegas in revenue in 2006, but the economy recovery is slow. Xi's anti-corruption campaign has targeted the city's money laundering and capital outflows. Tycoon Alvin Chow is among 11 people arrested for illegal gambling practices. China's digital music industry earns $11.2 billion in revenue, second only to the US. More than 650 million people listen to music online, an 80% increase over the last decade. Chinese platforms gain revenue from live shows, ads, ticket sales, and VIP subscriptions. Streaming represents 20% of the music industry's total, while 70% still comes from concerts. 12 regional governments extend women's maternity leave to incentivize childbirth. Beijing and Shanghai will offer 60 days on top of the 98-day national maternity leave. Dongsheng will allow one parent to take up to 1 year's leave. However, some worry that the new policies will increase hiring discrimination against women. Over the past 2 decades, China has become wealthier than the US in total net worth. Chinese assets grew from $7 to $120 trillion, while the US doubled its value to $90 trillion. Valuation gains in real estate, which accounts for 2/3 of wealth, and stocks drove growth. In China, the richest 10% have increased their share of national wealth to 67%. New regulations address the overuse and contamination of groundwater. 43.6% of groundwater monitoring stations record Grade V, the lowest water quality. On average, 15.8 billion cubic meters of water are overexploited in China every year. Fines for violating the new rules could reach up to $783,000. New Oriental, private education giant, announced a shift to selling agricultural products online. 1,500 schools will close, while teachers will participate in improving peasants' live stream skills. Shares of New Oriental and subsidiary company increased in prices after the announcement. Amid private tutoring overhaul, founder Yu Minghong saw his personal wealth drop by 70%. Over the past 20 years, Chinese fantasy, or xianxia, has come to dominate the entertainment industry. Rooted in Chinese wuxia martial arts fiction, xianxia incorporates Western cultural elements. Genre's rise is linked to the country's rediscovery of national identity with global influences. Fantasy video games, web novels, and TV and film have also gained international audiences. The CPC adopts a landmark resolution on major achievements in 100 years in the party's history. Attended by 370 top leaders, the 6th plenary focuses on ideology and party building. The 3rd historic resolution comes after Mao Zedong's in 1945 and Deng Xiaoping's in 1981. Xi Jinping's core position is highlighted, raised to the level of Mao and Deng. In the first meeting between the two leaders, Xi asked Biden to adopt a rational policy. China calls Taiwan tension dangerous, but the US affirms it doesn't support the island's independence. Visas for journalists, bilateral trade, and arms control were also on the agenda. Days before the meeting, the White House imposed new sanctions against Huawei and ZTE. On the Singles' Day online shopping festival, it hits record sales, but enthusiasm wanes. Alibaba had its slowest growth of sales since it founded the annual event in 2009. Amid big tech regulation, the company reduced real-time advertising and encouraged more donations. Anti-consumerism grows amongst Chinese youth, creating don't buy social media groups. China's manufacturing sector struggles to hire young people. Reasons include long and arduous working hours and few opportunities for personal growth. Young people prefer jobs in the gig economy, which offers more attractive wages. 41.1% of drivers for the Didi app were originally factory workers. China becomes the world's largest exporter of vaccines, with over 1.5 billion COVID-19 doses. Chinese production of vaccines for other diseases begins to compete with Western giants. Walvax's pneumonia vaccine earned $5.8 billion, taking 40% of Pfizer's Chinese market share. Chinese pharmaceuticals offer an option for the global south with lower prices and good quality. During the pandemic, Chinese exports to the US increased by 30% and by 50% to Europe. China produces 30% of US consumer goods and 14% of European industrial GDP. This allowed for increased European demand and emergency fiscal measures for the US. China's production also helped control inflation in the global north countries. The smog air apocalypse of 2013 affected 1/4 of China and 600 million people. Chinese leaders were forced to rethink the country's fossil fuel-based development. Xi's ecological civilization marks a shift from growth at all costs to high-quality growth. Beijing halved its PM 2.5 concentration since 2013, when the data began to be published. Esports fans celebrate the World Championship won by Chinese team Edward Gaming. The multiplayer video game competitions became an official sport in China in 2013. China is among the few countries that license esports gamers as a real profession. With 488 million esports lovers, the industry revenue grew to $21.4 billion last year. President Xi speaks virtually on climate change at the G20 Leaders Summit. Xi calls on developed countries to lead on emissions reduction and support developing nations. Advanced countries overwhelmingly have above average per capita CO2 emissions. In 2019, China's per capita emission was only 40% that of the US, the world's highest. Surveys find that 79.8% of Chinese people are worried about climate change. Air pollution and threat of disease were among the highest emissions-related worries. 97% support emissions reduction policies, and most are willing to make lifestyle changes. 1 out of 5.5 Chinese people use the country's 20 million shared bikes in over 360 cities. Chinese scientists developed technology to produce animal feed from industrial gas. Process uses a gas byproduct to synthesize cellular proteins. The technology could reduce China's dependence on soybean imports, totaling 100 million tons per year, and revolutionize carbon emissions reduction by using CO and CO2 as raw material. China implements the Personal Information Protection Law to safeguard consumer privacy. The law regulates the collection, use, and transfer of personal data and requires consent of users. The regulation responds to rising public concern over the handling of data by tech companies. The data protection officers are now in demand, paid high entry-level salaries. China marks the 50th anniversary since restoring its seat at the United Nations. In 1971, majority support of UN General Assembly countries helped break the US-led blockade. China is now the UN's largest contributor of peacekeepers and the second largest funder. In his anniversary speech, President Xi upholds multilateralism and opposes hegemony of all forms. The drop in Chinese magnesium production is expected to decrease exports by 10%. Causes include skyrocketing input prices and caps in emissions and energy use. China accounts for 85% of the global production of this metal, which is used to make aluminum alloys. Depending on imports from China, European aluminum makers call for government action. Scientists led by Pan Jianwei established the world's first integrated quantum communication network. The unhackable network achieves quantum key distribution over 4,600 kilometers across the country. Combining 700 optical fibers and 2 ground-to-satellite links, the network serves over 150 uses. Users include state banks, power grids, government sites, and other large-scale applications. The country estimates that 24.6% of Chinese adolescents suffer from depression. High pressure from school performance is one of the main causes. The government initiates mental health courses and offers assistance in universities and schools. The goal is to destigmatize psychological suffering and incentivize students to reach out for therapy. Cuba joins the Belt and Road Energy Partnership at the Qingdao Conference. 40% of China's current Belt and Road investments go to the energy sector. Between 2019 and 2020, investments in renewable energy increased to 57% of the total. The Caribbean island seeks investment, cooperation, and access to advanced Chinese technologies. In the last 15 years, China's state banks lent $137 billion to Latin America. Chinese investment and trade has expanded in the technology and energy sectors. The U.S. promises increased investment in the region, aiming to regain its lost influence. The U.S.-led Building Back Better World infrastructure project remains without a budget. China launches Shenzhou 13 for a 6-month mission to build the Tiangong space station. Wang Yaping became the first female taikonaut on the space station and to perform a spacewalk. The 41-year-old attended the Shenzhou 10 space mission in 2013 for 15 days. For years, the government expanded funding for women in science to address the gender imbalance. Public square dancing is a popular activity among middle-aged and elderly Chinese women. Dancing grannies flourished after the 1990s mass urbanization and building boom. Meetups and choreography are organized by group leaders, recalling Mao-era dance troupes. Collective dancing is an economical way for women to exercise and find their sense of belonging. China will create a $233 million fund to help protect biodiversity in developing countries. President Xi made the announcement during the COP15's UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The event took place in Kunming, capital of Yunnan, China's most biodiverse province. The new framework proposal sets 21 goals for the next decade and $200 billion in annual financing. The Hong Kong government announces a plan to build a northern metropolis in 20 years. 926,000 housing units will be created for 2.5 million people, a third of the city's population. With emphasis on the IT sector, 650,000 jobs will be provided in Hong Kong's new Silicon Valley. The plan aims to address the housing crisis and advance the city's integration with the mainland. Last year, just over 8 million couples registered marriages in China, down 12% from 2019. This marks a 40% drop and the 7th consecutive annual decline from the 2013 peak. Partly due to high costs, 1/3 of 3,000 people surveyed don't want to enter a relationship. 44% of female respondents are reluctant to marry, mostly because they don't want to have children. The national holiday hit, The Battle of Lake Changjin, is said to be the biggest box office in Chinese history. China's box office reached $3.9 billion in the first half year and overtook the US's in 2020. Prioritizing domestic productions, the country limits imported film and streaming content. For 6 years in a row, Chinese films have surpassed U.S. productions in the domestic box office. Huawei's finance chief Meng Wanzhou returns to China after 3 years in Canadian detention. In 2018, Meng was detained in Vancouver at the behest of the U.S. on Iran-related fraud charges. The U.S. dropped its extradition proceedings against Meng, who admitted to wrongdoing but no guilt. On the same day, Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, convicted for spying, left China. Yuan Renguo, ex-president of beverages giant Guizhou Moutai, was given a life prison sentence. The executive received $17 million in bribes to give distribution privileges of the brand. A national symbol, Moutai is a sorghum liquor commonly gifted in business and in politics. Anti-corruption policies targeted this gifting custom, but the company remains the world's top drinks maker. Over 20 provinces and regions face power cuts, mostly affecting heavy industrial users. Due to soaring coal prices and capped electricity rates, coal plants reduce output to avoid losses. China's proactive measures to achieve carbon emission goals are among the factors. The government's economic planner vows to prioritize power supply for people's basic needs. A new hybrid rice variety is featured at the 2021 Dongsheng Harvest Festival. The 2-meter-tall giant rice resists disease and flooding and grows in saline and alkaline soils. Cultivation combined with fish, shrimp, and crayfish farming increases income of peasants. The festival attracted over 100,000 visitors who participated in harvest-related activities. With over $300 billion in debt, the construction giant Evergrande faces potential bankruptcy. While negotiating a solution, more than half of the company's 800 projects have been stalled. Growing with the real estate boom since 2000, Evergrande earned $78 billion in 2020. But last year's regulation capped the sector's debt to tighten borrowing from banks. China orders its mining companies that broke laws and standards to leave the DR Congo. Wu Peng, a senior diplomat for the region, said companies will be punished by the Chinese government. Kinshasa is currently renegotiating its infrastructure for minerals agreements with Beijing. Meanwhile, the IMF is giving the DRC pressure to clean up deals to access its credit line. At the UN General Assembly, President Xi pledges that China will stop building coal plants abroad. The country funded only 13% of total coal power capacity overseas between 2013 and 2019. This move could affect 44 international coal plant projects worth $50 billion. China's pledge also includes support for Global South countries in low-carbon energy development. China commemorates the 90th anniversary of September 18th incident. The Mukden incident was used as a pretext for Japanese invasion in the 14-year-long war. During World War II, China suffered 35 million casualties while defending against fascism. To remember this day, activities were held and sirens wailed in cities across the country. Chinese people living in cities grew from 18% to 64% since 1978. Overconstruction, debt, and insufficient migration led to the creation of so-called ghost cities. Government-led investment has attracted residents and businesses, reviving these ghost cities. Zhengdong is now home to nearly 1 million residents, with property prices increasing tenfold in 10 years. China condemns a military coup in Guinea and calls for the release of President Alpha Condé. Guinea is the world's second-largest producer of bauxite, an essential raw material of aluminum. The country supplies 50% of bauxite imports to China, the largest producer and consumer of aluminum. The Simandu project is also the world's largest undeveloped iron deposit. the demand for high-tech products is driving up prices of rare earth elements. These metals are essential for producing electronics, electric cars, wind turbines, among other products. Up to 100% price increase is expected to affect profits of small and mid-sized manufacturers. China is responsible for 85% of global refining and owns the entire production chain. China has a history of philanthropy carried out by politicians, scholars, and merchants. The tradition is rooted in the Confucian teaching that the rich should contribute to the well-being of all. Prominent philanthropists including Fan Li, who gave his fortunes away 3 times 2,500 years ago. Song Dynasty politician Fan Zhongyan turned his home to school for the poor. China caps rent increases to 5% per year in another measure to control housing costs. Square meter prices to buy new homes fell 8% countrywide, but increased 3.3% in big cities this year. The government will implement property taxes and incentives for building affordable housing. Addressing housing issues is one of the priorities for achieving the Common Prosperity Goal. The plan for the Guangdong-Macau Cooperation Zone expands one country, two systems. The goal is to further integrate the Guangdong mainland in the former Portuguese colony of Macau. Macanese workers will benefit while businesses pay less taxes in the economic zone. Macau can also diversify its economy, where 70% of the GDP comes from casino-related industries. Chinese Junqiao technology innovates mushroom growing while addressing rural poverty. The cultivation technique doesn't require fertilizers, preserves nature, and demands little land area and labor. 10 square meters can produce over 1,000 kilograms of mushrooms annually, generating $300,000 per hectare. In 2017, a UN project adopted the technique, already implemented in over 100 countries. In Tokyo, China topped the medal tally at the Paralympics for the 5th time in a row. 251 athletes participated in the Games, winning China 207 medals. Highlights include wheelchair basketball, badminton, marathon running, and track and field. Team China's success is thanks to increasing livelihood support for people with disabilities. The Supreme People's Court reaffirms the illegality of 996 culture based on 10 labor dispute cases. Working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week has become commonplace in the country. Recent cases of deaths due to overworking have sparked public outrage. From delivery drivers to programmers, big tech workers are amongst the most affected. The government announces measures to regulate online fan clubs organized to idolize celebrities. Online abuse, excessive spending, and celebrity stalking characterize the chaotic fan culture. The 10-point plan targets celebrity rankings and tightens oversight of marketing agencies. The goal is to rein in the $15 billion industry and protect the well-being of Chinese youth. China limits the playing time of online games to 3 hours weekly for youth under 18 years old. Using real name verification, minors will be restricted from playing during school days. Regulators push for increased enforcement by companies, including in-game purchases. Minors still account for a small portion of the industry's $369 billion expected revenue this year. The government reduces the amount of written tests and homework in primary and middle schools. The goal is to reduce pressure on children and families in a highly competitive system. A national survey finds that 67% of students do not get enough sleep. The educational reform will change the format of exams and evaluation criteria. President Xi announces a new cycle of reforms aimed at fighting inequality in the country. He says that China needs to improve income distribution and strengthen the welfare state. The government will start creating public policies to confront this challenge. The goal is to promote common prosperity by reconciling economic efficiency with social justice. Common prosperity refers to the sharing of material and cultural wealth in the society. This centennial goal continues the work of predecessors Dongsheng and Hu Jintao. Letting a few get rich first was seen as a transitional phase in building socialism. Aim of developing the productive forces was to enable more people to prosper. China lifted 850 million people out of poverty and created a middle class of 400 million people. However, the share of wealth of the richest 1% grew to over 30% in the last 2 decades. Inequality between the countryside and the city, regions, and social classes has also increased. Meanwhile, the high costs of housing, education, and health hinder social mobility. Tech giant Tencent Holdings announces a new $7.7 billion Common Prosperity Fund. The fund aims to help low-income groups, boost rural revitalization, and improve social services. Announcement comes after Xi calls on the rich and big companies to give back to society. Beyond donations, the government is overhauling the tax and income distribution systems. The Taliban takes over the Afghan capital of Kabul as US pulls out its troops after the 20-year war. The war cost over $2 trillion and hundreds of thousands of lives, leaving the country in turmoil. Beijing maintains contact with the Taliban and Washington and its embassy operations. China is set to play a key role in the country's reconstruction, but stresses cutting terrorist ties. After boycotting Xinjiang cotton, some Western brands are losing market share in China. Chinese social media campaigns have led to drops in sales for Adidas and H&M. Meanwhile, sales for Chinese sports brands have soared thanks to data-driven marketing. As Anta, Li-Ning, and Xstep gain popularity, US threatens them with sanctions. China leads the world in research on artificial intelligence. In 2020, AI research papers from China were the most cited, surpassing the US for the first time. Led by the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence, researchers have created a virtual person. Hua Jibing can write poems and draw, and soon will be able to make websites. Museum culture is thriving in China, with 540 million visitors last year. The country's nearly 6,000 museums hosted 250,000 exhibitions and educational activities. Popular TV programs and consumer products fuel renewed interest in cultural heritage. In the last 5 years, an average of 1 new museum was built every 2 days. news on China at dongshengnews.org.